The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that seeped into every corner, wrapping itself around the wooden pews and the cold, polished floors. The soft shuffle of legal papers mixed with the quiet hum of whispered conversations. Lawyers straightened their ties, adjusting stacks of documents with mechanical precision, while the judge, perched high on the bench, observed with an air of practiced authority. His gavel rested within easy reach, a symbol of order and control, ready to strike the first sign of chaos. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow, giving the room an almost clinical coldness, as if the truth itself was something to be dissected rather than felt. The case unfolding was just another file in a stack of many, its details blending into the monotony of legal jargon and procedure. The accused sat quietly, hands clasped tightly, eyes heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The defense attorney flipped through pages preparing to speak, but the words felt rehearsed, hollow against the looming backdrop of injustice that no one dared name aloud. Then, without warning, the double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a sudden jarring force. The noise sliced through the monotony like a blade. Heads snapped around, eyes widening, as a small figure stumbled into view, a 6-year-old black boy, his face streaked with tears, breath hitching in ragged sobs. His clothes hung slightly askew as if he'd dressed in a hurry, his tiny shoes barely tied. The echoes of his footsteps filled the vast room, each one a fragile beat against the silence that had settled like dust. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. The judge's gavel, midair, hung in suspended hesitation, forgotten. The prosecutor's words died on his lips. The defense attorney's notes slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like fragile leaves in a breeze. The hum of whispered conversations dissolved into an oppressive, deafening stillness. The boy's sobs were the only sound now, raw and unfiltered, reverberating off the cold walls. He stood just inside the courtroom, his small chest heaving with the effort of holding back emotions too big for his tiny frame. His hands, clenched into trembling fists at his sides, betrayed both fear and defiance. Eyes red and swollen from crying, he scanned the room until his gaze found the one face he couldn't bear to ignore: the person on trial. A soft, choked whimper escaped him, filled with a heartbreak too profound for words. Taking a shaky step forward, his voice broke the silence, not with the hesitant murmur of a child unsure of himself, but with the piercing clarity of a soul unburdened by the layers of adult pretense. "Please, stop lying!" he cried out, his words crashing against the walls with the force of undeniable truth. That's not what happened. The effect was instantaneous. The room, once governed by procedure and decorum, now held its breath. The judge, known for his stoic demeanor and unwavering control, sat frozen, the gavel slipping from his grasp with a soft, hollow thud. Lawyers and jurors alike turned in their seats, their expressions shifting from annoyance to disbelief, and then to something deeper, something resembling guilt. The boy's voice echoed, refusing to fade into the background like so many truths had before. There was no filter, no legal jargon to soften the blow, just the raw, unvarnished words of a child who had seen too much and understood more than he should. His small figure seemed to shrink and expand all at once, tiny in stature, yet towering over every adult present. His tears weren't just the product of sadness. They were a protest, a plea for someone, anyone, to acknowledge what had been conveniently ignored. In that courtroom, filled with people trained to argue facts and evidence, no one knew what to say. The judge's lips parted slightly, but no words came. His authority, so absolute just moments before, crumbled under the weight of a child's simple, heart-wrenching plea. The boy took another step forward, his sobs quieter now, but his resolve solidifying with every breath. His trembling fists relaxed slightly, not out of comfort, but from the exhaustion of carrying a truth too heavy for his small heart. He didn't need permission to speak. The courtroom was his now, not because of power granted by law, but because truth doesn't ask for permission. And in that moment, no one, no lawyer, no judge, no carefully crafted lie, could compete with the undeniable, heartbreaking honesty of a 6-year-old boy who just wanted someone to tell the truth. The scene shifts from the cold, sterile courtroom to the warm, modest confines of a small home, a stark contrast to the imposing walls of justice. It's a simple space, the kind where love fills the gaps that money can't. The furniture is worn but well kept, with faded cushions that hold the echoes of laughter and whispered bedtime stories. The kitchen table, scarred with the marks of years gone by, stands as the heart of the home, where lessons are taught not from textbooks, but from life itself. In this home lives the boy, a 6-year-old whose world is framed by the faces of his family. His mother's gentle touch when she brushes his hair, his father's firm yet warm voice when teaching him right from wrong, and the endless lessons woven into the fabric of their daily lives. They don't have much, but what they do have is rich with values, honesty, courage, and the unyielding belief that truth always matters, even when it's hard to speak. Flashbacks flicker like old photographs, his mother kneeling beside him, her eyes soft but serious as she says, "Always tell the truth, baby, even when your voice shakes, especially then." Another memory, his father's calloused hands resting on his small shoulders, the words etched into his heart. Courage isn't about being the loudest. It's about standing tall when it's easier to sit down. But life isn't always fair. The boy's family faces struggles, bills piled on the counter, quiet arguments behind closed doors, the weight of working twice as hard for half as much. Despite it all, their home is a haven, filled with resilience and hope, until the day it's not. The court case that shatters their fragile peace isn't just a legal battle, it's a personal war. Someone the boy loves, his parent, his protector, is accused of something they didn't do. The charge is serious, the consequences even more so. It's not just about a crime. It's about their very identity being put on trial in a system that too often looks the other way. The boy wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to hear the lies spilling from polished lips, the rehearsed testimonies that twisted reality into something unrecognizable. But curiosity, or perhaps fate, pulled him to the courthouse that day. He sat quietly in the back, his small frame hidden behind towering adults, his wide eyes absorbing every word. What he heard shook him to his core. Grown men and women swearing oaths to tell the truth, weaving falsehoods with ease. They spoke about his family, painting them with strokes of deceit and malice, turning someone he knew to be kind and good into a villain. Each lie felt like a stone thrown at the fragile glass of his understanding of the world. And then there was the judge, the man who sat above them all, robed in authority, his gavel a symbol of finality. He was known for being strict, his rulings sharp and uncompromising. To the boy, he was like a character from the stories his father told, an immovable force, the person who decided what was right and what was wrong. But as the boy listened, he saw not the wisdom of justice in the judge's eyes, but something else, indifference, perhaps, or the weariness of someone who had heard too many lies to care about the truth. The courtroom was a theater. The case, a script written by those who had the power to shape narratives. The defense spoke with passion, the prosecution with precision, but both were lost in a language the boy didn't fully understand. What he did understand, however, was that they were getting it wrong. The truth was slipping through the cracks, buried under legal jargon and carefully constructed arguments. And that's when the boy's heart decided what his mind had been wrestling with. He couldn't sit silently while the people he loved were crushed under the weight of lies. He didn't have evidence to present or a speech prepared. All he had was the truth, the raw, unpolished kind that adults often forget in their quest to win. He burst into the courtroom not out of defiance, but desperation. Desperation to be heard in a world that often ignores voices like his. His tears weren't just from sadness. They were the manifestation of a truth too heavy for a 6-year-old heart to carry alone. As he stood there, trembling but unyielding, his presence did what no lawyer's argument could. It pierced through the armor of legal proceedings, reaching the humanity hidden beneath the judge's stern exterior. The courtroom wasn't prepared for him, because the courtroom wasn't prepared for the truth, not the kind that comes without agenda, without pretense. Just the simple, undeniable truth from a child who had nothing to gain except justice for someone he loved. In that moment, the judge wasn't just a figure of authority. He was a man faced with something the law books never taught him to handle. A child's courage laid bare, demanding not just to be heard, but to be believed. And for the first time in his long career, the judge found himself speechless, not because he didn't know the rules, but because the rules had never prepared him for this. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that settles into the walls, making even the faintest rustle of papers sound like a thunderclap. Lawyers stood, voices rising and falling in a carefully orchestrated dance of rhetoric, their faces masked with professionalism. But beneath the surface, there was something darker: deceit. Witnesses, rehearsed and polished, took the stand, their oaths of truth as hollow as the echoes their words left behind. The judge sat towering above them all, his expression carved from stone, gavel resting like an exclamation mark to punctuate the proceedings whenever needed. His face betrayed nothing, as if he'd heard it all before, perhaps even believed he had. But outside those heavy wooden doors, beyond the sterile walls of the courtroom, was a heart pounding with the kind of raw emotion that didn't fit into legal jargon or courtroom decorum. A small boy, no older than 6, stood trembling, not with fear, but with an overwhelming cocktail of confusion, frustration, and the unbearable weight of truth. His tiny fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white against dark skin, holding not just his breath, but the secret no one seemed willing to hear. Then, like a crack of lightning slicing through a stormy sky, the silence was broken, not by a verdict, not by a lawyer's objection, but by the sudden, jarring sound of courtroom doors slamming open. The hinges groaned as if protesting the disruption, but it was too late. The boy burst in, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing architecture, but his presence was more commanding than any gavel's strike. His cheeks were wet, stained with tears that didn't ask for permission to fall. His chest heaved with sobs, but his legs carried him forward with a determination that belied his age. All eyes snapped to him. Conversations froze mid-sentence. A lawyer's finger, once pointing accusingly, hung suspended in the air. The judge's gavel, lifted in preparation to restore order, remained frozen, as if the very gravity of the boy's entrance had stolen the power from his hand. and then the boy spoke. "Stop! You're lying! That's not the truth!" His voice, though small, ricocheted off the marble floors and high ceilings, more powerful than any legal argument that had filled the room before. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished, but it carried something no witness had managed to convey, undeniable, heart-wrenching authenticity. The judge blinked, his stern mask slipping ever so slightly, revealing a flicker of something human beneath the robe. Was it surprise? Guilt? Maybe even shame? His gavel lowered, forgotten entirely, as if even the symbol of his authority recognized the futility of trying to silence a voice fueled by pure, unfiltered truth. The boy's sobs punctuated the stunned silence, each one a beat in the courtroom's new rhythm, a rhythm set not by legal proceedings, but by the trembling heart of a child desperate to be heard. "I saw what really happened," the boy cried, his words spilling out like a dam had broken. "You're trying to make my dad look bad, but he didn't do anything wrong." His voice cracked, fragile yet fierce, woven with threads of betrayal and desperation. He wasn't just fighting for his father's innocence. He was fighting against a system too big, too cold, too indifferent to the simple clarity only a child could bring. Gasps rippled through the room, not dramatic, staged gasps like in a movie, but sharp, involuntary intakes of breath from people who had forgotten what it felt like to witness pure, undiluted honesty. Some looked away, unable to meet the boy's tear-streaked face. Others stared, transfixed, their professional facades crumbling under the weight of his words. The boy's small hands gestured wildly, pointing to the men in suits, the witnesses who had spun their web of lies, his finger trembling not with fear, but righteous anger. "You're lying," he repeated, voice growing stronger with each accusation. "I saw you. That's not what happened." The judge, who had presided over countless cases, who had seen hardened criminals and eloquent attorneys, found himself speechless. His robe felt heavier, his bench suddenly higher than it needed to be, like a barrier between him and the reality unfolding below. He opened his mouth to speak, to restore order, but what words could possibly follow the boy's raw plea? A bailiff stepped forward instinctively, as if to guide the boy out, but the judge's raised hand stopped him. For once, it wasn't about the rules. It was about listening. The boy's knees buckled slightly, and he sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had done. His sobs softened into hiccuping breaths, his voice spent, but his message echoing louder than any gavel could strike. And in that courtroom, filled with people who claimed to seek justice, it was a 6-year-old boy who reminded them what justice actually looked like. Not polished, not rehearsed, but raw, vulnerable, and undeniably true. The courtroom remained suspended in an almost surreal stillness, the echoes of the boy's trembling voice still lingering like faint ripples on water. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, unable to rush past the raw, unfiltered truth that had been laid bare by someone society often dismisses as too young to understand. The boy's small frame stood in stark contrast to the imposing grandeur of the courtroom, polished wooden benches, towering walls adorned with symbols of justice, and the looming bench where the judge sat, cloaked in authority. But it wasn't the robe or the gavel that commanded the room anymore. It was the tear-streaked face of a 6-year-old whose voice had cracked open, the facade of power with nothing more than honesty. The judge, a man known for his unwavering sternness, felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. His gavel, once a symbol of control, now felt like dead weight in his hand. His gaze, typically sharp and dispassionate, softened as it met the boy's watery eyes. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, doubt crept into the judge's mind, not about the law, but about the truths he had chosen to accept without question. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the struggle to suppress an emotion he rarely allowed to surface: empathy. This was not the voice of an attorney armed with legal jargon or a witness rehearsing carefully crafted statements. This was the voice of a child whose only weapon was truth, pure and piercing. The boy hadn't been coached. He hadn't been prepared. He had simply spoken from the rawest place imaginable, the heart. The lawyers, whose sharp words had filled the room moments before, now sat in stunned silence, their arguments unraveling like threads pulled from a fraying cloth. The prosecution's lead attorney glanced down at his notes, suddenly meaningless scribbles on a page, while the defense attorney's eyes glistened with a quiet mix of gratitude and awe. They all knew, in that instant, that the boy's words had done what no cross-examination ever could: expose the brittle foundation of their carefully constructed case. The crowd, jurors, observers, even the court stenographer, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whispers floated through the air like fragile paper, words exchanged in hushed tones that couldn't drown out the boy's simple declaration of truth. Some lowered their gazes, ashamed of their silent complicity in the proceedings, while others exchanged glances, acknowledging without words the uncomfortable reality the boy had forced them to see. One juror, an elderly woman with decades of life experience etched into the lines of her face, felt tears well up in her eyes. She'd come into the courtroom expecting facts, evidence, and legal arguments, not to have her conscience awakened by the clarity of a child's voice. Another juror, a man who had prided himself on his logical reasoning, found his carefully guarded skepticism eroding under the weight of the boy's undeniable sincerity. The accused, whether it was the boy's parent, guardian, or someone equally precious, sat motionless, eyes brimming with both heartbreak and pride. They hadn't wanted this. They had tried to shield the boy from the harshness of the world, from the sterile cruelty of a courtroom. But here he was, standing taller than anyone in the room, not because of his height, but because of his courage. The judge finally cleared his throat, the sound startling in the heavy silence. His lips parted, but the usual authoritative tone was absent. Instead, his voice wavered slightly, betraying the depth of his internal struggle. What could he possibly say after that? No legal precedent could outweigh the moral gravity of the boy's words. "Young man," the judge began, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it in that courtroom. He paused, swallowing the lump forming in his throat. "Your words, they matter, more than you know." But the boy didn't need validation. He hadn't spoken to be heard by the court. He had spoken because he couldn't bear the weight of silence any longer. As the proceedings resumed, nothing felt the same. The prosecution stumbled, their arguments now brittle under the scorching light of the boy's truth. The defense stood with renewed strength, bolstered by the undeniable evidence of human decency that had just unfolded. And the judge? He would carry the boy's words long after the case was over, long after the gavel fell for the last time, because in that courtroom, surrounded by adults who thought they understood justice, it was a child who truly defined it. The courtroom sat in suffocating silence, the echoes of the boy's trembling voice still reverberating against the cold marble walls. Time seemed to pause, as if even the ticking of the clock above the judge's bench dared not interrupt the fragile moment that had just unfolded. The judge, known for his unwavering authority and sharp decisiveness, found himself uncharacteristically speechless, his gavel hovering mid-air, forgotten in his grasp. His eyes, usually shielded by the impartiality demanded of his role, betrayed a flicker of something rare: vulnerability. The words of the small boy had pierced through the hardened armor he'd built over years of legal battles and courtroom decorum. The boy's voice, raw and unfiltered, had done what no attorney, no legal precedent, no cross-examination had ever managed to do. It had laid bare the undeniable truth. Clearing his throat, the judge finally set the gavel down with a soft thud that barely registered against the weight of the boy's declaration. His voice, when he spoke, was devoid of its usual commanding resonance. It trembled slightly, as though the very foundation of his authority had been shaken by the courage of a child. "Court will recess," he managed, his words hanging awkwardly in the charged air. His gaze lingered on the boy, his stern facade cracked by the enormity of what had just transpired. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another file in a sea of paperwork. This was justice stripped to its core, laid bare by the innocent yet fearless words of a 6-year-old who refused to let lies prevail. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in murmurs of disbelief and reflection. Jurors exchanged glances, their expressions marked by a newfound sense of moral clarity. Attorneys shuffled their papers with unsteady hands, the carefully constructed narratives they'd woven unraveling before their eyes. The boy's family rushed to his side, enveloping him in an embrace that was equal parts relief and awe. They hadn't expected this. They'd tried to protect him from the courtroom's cold realities, but it was his voice that had shattered the illusion of justice and forced the truth to surface. As the courtroom cleared for recess, the judge remained seated, staring at the empty space where the boy had stood moments before. His thoughts were a whirlwind, years of legal doctrine clashing with the undeniable simplicity of the boy's testimony. He'd presided over countless cases, heard thousands of witnesses, yet none had left him grappling with his conscience like this. The law was supposed to be objective, but today it had been humbled by something far greater than statutes and codes: human truth. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was palpably different. The judge's gavel struck with less finality, his voice steady but softer, carrying the weight of reflection. "I've decided to reopen this case," he announced, his gaze sweeping across the room but settling briefly on the boy, whose wide, innocent eyes held more wisdom than many adults could fathom. The boy was called to testify officially. Standing on a wooden stool to reach the microphone, his small hands gripping its edges, he recounted what he'd seen and heard, not with rehearsed statements or legal jargon, but with the unadulterated honesty only a child could possess. His voice, though shaky at times, never wavered in its truth. He spoke of what he witnessed, how he felt, and why he couldn't stay silent. Each word dismantled the lies that had been carefully layered in the courtroom. The prosecution's case, once solid as stone, crumbled under the weight of his simple declarations. Witnesses who had perjured themselves found their credibility in tatters, exposed not by aggressive cross-examinations, but by the quiet conviction of a child who refused to let injustice win. As the trial drew to a close, the judge's final remarks were unlike any he'd given before. His voice carried the gravitas of a man who'd been changed, not just in his role as a judge, but as a human being. "Justice," he said, pausing to glance once more at the boy, "is not always found in the strongest voices, but often in the quietest truths." The verdict was delivered swiftly, the wrongly accused vindicated, their name cleared not by legal prowess, but by the unwavering honesty of a 6-year-old boy. As the judge dismissed the court, he didn't rise immediately. His eyes followed the boy as he walked out, hand in hand with his family, his small figure leaving an indelible mark on the hearts of everyone present. The judge sat for a long time after the courtroom had emptied, reflecting on the case that would haunt and inspire him in equal measure. He'd seen the law in all its forms, but that day he'd witnessed something far more profound. The pure, unadulterated power of truth, spoken without fear, without agenda, and without the constraints of adulthood's cynicism. A child had reminded them all what justice truly meant. The heavy doors of the courtroom creaked open, spilling the fading afternoon light across the polished floors, a stark contrast to the dim tension that had hung thick just moments before. The 6-year-old black boy stepped out, his small frame dwarfed by the towering marble columns and the imposing architecture of the justice system he had just confronted. But there was no fear in his steps now, only a quiet, resolute strength that seemed to radiate from him like an invisible shield. His tiny hand was clasped tightly in his parents', fingers intertwined, not just as a sign of comfort, but as a symbol of unity, resilience, and unspoken pride. Gone were the tears that had streamed down his cheeks when he first burst into the courtroom, replaced now by a look of calm determination etched onto his young face. His eyes, wide and soulful, held the weight of something far greater than his years, a truth that had echoed louder than any gavel strike, more powerful than any legal argument. Behind him, the courtroom doors slowly swung shut, muffling the whispers that still lingered in the air. The murmurs of disbelief, admiration, and reflection among those who had witnessed what had just transpired. Inside, adults in suits and uniforms, judges, lawyers, jurors, remained seated, their expressions shadowed with a mixture of awe and discomfort, grappling with the raw, undeniable truth a child had laid bare. The echoes of his words, simple, heartfelt, and fearless, still reverberated off the walls, refusing to be silenced even after his departure. As the boy and his family stepped onto the courthouse steps, the world outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of what had just occurred. The sky was painted in hues of gold and crimson, the sun casting long shadows that danced around the boy's feet. It was as if the universe was honoring his courage, the fading light a gentle applause for his bravery. His parent looked down at him, eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming pride. They didn't need to say anything. Their grip tightened slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the storm their son had weathered and the beacon he had become. They walked forward, each step a testament to the unbreakable bond of family, to the lessons of truth and justice whispered at bedtime, to the unwavering belief that even the smallest voice can echo with the power to change the world. As they disappeared into the crowd, the camera lingered on the empty courthouse steps, a silent monument to the moment that had just unfolded. The place where a child's courage had pierced through the layers of legal rhetoric, exposing the heart of justice itself, not in the hands of those who wield power, but in the honesty of a boy who refused to let lies stand unchallenged. The screen fades to black, and a voiceover emerges, soft yet resonant, carrying the weight of the story just told. In a world of noise, sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest truth. One child's courage turned a courtroom of silence into a beacon of justice. The words linger, leaving the audience with a sense of both closure and reflection, a reminder that bravery isn't measured by age or authority, but by the willingness to speak out when it matters most. If this story inspired you, subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that prove courage has no age